Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The spring of 1878 dawned crisp and promising across the Missouri frontier. In Springfield, a bustling crossroads town still bearing the scars of Civil War, families gathered their belongings and loaded their hopes into canvas-covered wagons. They were bound for new opportunities in the untamed wilderness of the Ozark Mountains, following trails carved by countless others who had ventured into those ancient brooding hills. But this particular caravan would never reach its destination. Within days of departing, the entire wagon train, 23 souls, their livestock, their dreams, and every trace of their existence would vanish as completely as morning mist in the hollow valleys of the Ozarks. What happened to them remains one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries. No bodies were ever found. No wreckage was ever discovered intact. The only evidence of their passage were fragments scattered like breadcrumbs through the dense wilderness, broken wheel spokes, scraps of clothing, and oxen tracks that seemed to end in mid-stride, as if the very earth had opened to swallow them whole. For nearly a century and a half, the fate of the lost wagon train has haunted the Ozark Mountains, spawning legends that still send shivers down the spines of those brave enough to venture into the deepest hollows where sunlight barely penetrates the canopy above. The story begins on a deceptively ordinary morning in early April, when wagon master Jonathan Hale stood in the dusty main street of Springfield, checking his pocket watch against the position of the sun. At 42, Hale was a seasoned frontiersman whose weathered face told the story of countless journeys through hostile territory. His calloused hands had guided dozens of wagon trains safely through Indian country, outlaw-infested valleys, and treacherous mountain passes. He was known throughout southwestern Missouri as a man who could read the land like scripture and navigate by instinct when trails disappeared beneath his feet. Beside him, his wife Eleanor adjusted the bonnet that framed her still beautiful face, her green eyes scanning the assembled wagons with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. At 38, she had followed her husband across half the continent, bearing and raising their 3 children in a dozen different frontier towns. But something about this journey felt different to her, a premonition she couldn't quite articulate, like a shadow falling across her heart on a cloudless day. The other families were making their final preparations with the methodical efficiency of experienced travelers. There was Samuel Brennan, a blacksmith from Kentucky, traveling with his pregnant wife Martha and their twin boys, barely old enough to walk, but already showing the sturdy independence of frontier children. The Coopers, Thomas, his wife Rebecca, and their teenage daughter Sarah, had sold their general store in Springfield to chase rumors of rich farming land in the Arkansas Territory. Old Henrik Larsen, a Norwegian immigrant with hands like tree roots and a voice like distant thunder, drove a wagon loaded with carpenter's tools and dreams of building a mill by some unnamed river deep in the mountains. Young Billy Thornton, barely 18 but tough as leather, served as the train's scout and hunter. His sharp eyes could spot game or danger at disty, answers that amazed even veteran frontiersmen, and his rifle never seemed to miss its mark. The other men looked to him for signs of trouble along the trail, trusting his instincts as much as they trusted Hale's leadership. Rounding out the group were the Kellys, an Irish family fleeing poverty and prejudice in the eastern cities, and the Washingtons, former slaves seeking freedom and opportunity in territories where their past wouldn't follow them. As the sun climbed higher, painting the limestone bluffs around Springfield in shades of gold and amber, the wagons began to roll. The oxen leaned into their yokes, wheels creaked into motion, and the great journey began with the same mundane details that had marked 1,000 other departures. Children ran alongside the wagons until their mothers called them back. Dogs barked farewell to their canine friends in town. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent in Henrik Larsson's former shop, and dust began to settle on the shelves of the cooper's abandoned store. But as the wagon train wound its way south through the rolling hills that surrounded Springfield, the cheerful chatter of the morning gradually gave way to a more subdued atmosphere. The Ozark Mountains rose before them like a green wall, their peaks shrouded in mist that seemed to cling to the ridge lines, even as the afternoon sun burned bright overhead. The forest that covered these ancient hills was different from the more familiar woodlands of eastern Missouri, older, denser, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. The landscape itself told a story of tremendous age and hidden depths. These mountains were among the oldest on the North American continent, their foundations laid down when the world was young and continents were still finding their places on the map. Limestone caverns honeycombed the bedrock, creating vast underground networks that early explorers had only begun to map. Springs bubbled up from mysterious sources deep beneath the earth, feeding crystal-clear streams that carved serpentine paths through valleys so narrow that wagon wheels sometimes scraped against rock walls on both sides of the trail. By the third day of their journey, the wagon train had penetrated deep into the heart of the Ozark wilderness. They were following a little-used trail that Hale had traveled once before, years earlier, when he was guiding a surveying party through the region. The path wound through a landscape of breathtaking beauty and haunting isolation, past towering bluffs of gray limestone, through meadows where wildflowers nodded in the breeze, and alongside streams so clear that every pebble on the bottom seemed magnified and close enough to touch. The nights were filled with sounds that city dwellers had never imagined, the haunting calls of owls, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush, and the distant howling of wolves that sent shivers through even the bravest members of the party. But there were other sounds, too, sounds that seemed to have no natural explanation. More than one member of the party reported hearing what sounded like voices calling from distant valleys, though no human habitation was visible for miles in any direction. Eleanor Hale found herself sleeping poorly, startled awake by dreams she couldn't quite remember, but which left her heart racing and her hands trembling. During the day, she found herself counting and recounting the members of their party, as if she feared that someone might simply disappear when she wasn't looking. Her husband noticed her anxiety, but attributed it to the natural stress of the journey and the wild, untamed nature of the country through which they were traveling. On the evening of April 15, 1878, the wagon train made camp in a sheltered valley beside a stream that local maps identified as Roaring River. The water was cold and sweet, fed by springs that bubbled up from limestone caves hidden somewhere in the surrounding hills. The wagons were arranged in the traditional circle, with the livestock secured in the center and guards posted at intervals around the perimeter. Cooking fires were built up, filling the valley with the homey smells of salt pork, beans, and coffee that had sustained travelers across the American frontier for generations. But even as the families settled in for what they expected to be just another night on the trail, changes were already beginning that would transform this peaceful scene into the opening chapter of one of America's most enduring mysteries. The temperature began to drop as the sun disappeared behind the western ridges, and a mist began to rise from the stream, thickening with unnatural rapidity until visibility was reduced to mere yards in any direction. Young Billy Thornton, standing guard near the downstream end of the camp, later described feeling as though invisible eyes were watching him from the fog-shrouded forest. Every few minutes he thought he glimpsed movement among the trees, shadows that seemed too large and too purposeful to be cast by wind-blown branches. When he called out challenges into the mist, his voice seemed to be absorbed by the fog itself, producing no echo and apparently traveling no distance at all. As the night wore on, the fog grew thicker still, until family members could barely see their own wagons through the gray-white wall that surrounded the camp. Mothers pulled their children close, and fathers checked and rechecked their rifles by the light of fires that seemed strangely dim and ineffective against the encroaching darkness. The livestock grew restless, lowing and snorting with an anxiety that their handlers had never seen before, as if they sensed some approaching danger that human perception could not detect. And then, somewhere in the small hours of the morning, between the setting of the moon and the first hint of dawn, something happened in that mist-shrouded valley that would erase 23 human beings from the face of the earth as completely as if they had never existed at all. To understand the true horror of what befell the wagon train, one must first understand the nature of the Ozark Mountains in 1878. This was a land still reeling from the devastation of civil war, where brother had fought brother in some of the most vicious guerrilla warfare the continent had ever seen. The conflict had ended officially in 1865, but in the isolated hollows and hidden valleys of the Ozarks, old grudges died hard, and former bushwhackers still rode the night trails, settling scores that dated back to before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The region's geography contributed to its lawless reputation. Unlike the broad plains and gentle hills of eastern Missouri, the Ozarks presented travelers with a maze of narrow valleys, steep ridges, and hidden passages known only to locals who had learned them from their fathers and grandfathers. A man could disappear into these mountains and remain hidden for decades, emerging only when he chose to, and then only to those he trusted with his life. Entire communities existed in hollows so remote that they appeared on no government maps and received no visits from tax collectors or federal marshals. Springfield itself, the departure point for the ill-fated wagon train, had been occupied alternately by Union and Confederate forces throughout the war. The Battle of Wilson's Creek, fought just 10 miles from the town center, had seen over 2,500 casualties in a single day of fighting that determined the fate of Missouri for the duration of the conflict. The scars of that battle, and dozens of smaller engagements fought throughout the region, were still visible in 1878. Burned-out homesteads dotted the landscape, their blackened chimneys standing like tombstones in overgrown fields where families had once carved out lives from the wilderness. The Current River, which flowed through the heart of the region where the wagon train disappeared, had been a highway for both armies during the war. Confederate forces had used its hidden channels to move supplies and reinforcements, while Union patrols had swept its banks in futile attempts to interdict the rebel supply lines. Local folklore spoke of battles fought in riverside meadows, where the grass had grown back red and stayed that color for years after the last shots were fired. In the town of Mountain View, 20 miles southeast of where the wagon train was last seen, the courthouse still bore bullet holes from a raid conducted by Confederate irregulars in 1863. The raiders had burned most of the town's business district and made off with enough supplies to keep a guerrilla band operational for months. Many of the men who participated in that raid had never formally surrendered when the war ended, instead melting back into the mountain wilderness where they continued to live by the gun and the knife. It was into this landscape of hidden dangers and unhealed wounds that Jonathan Hale led his small band of hopeful emigrants. The trail they followed had been used for generations by hunters, trappers, and traders, but it was not a route for the faint of heart. In places, the path was barely wide enough for a single wagon, with sheer drops on one side and vertical rock faces on the other. Stream crossings required careful scouting to find fords shallow enough for loaded wagons, but not so rocky as to break wheels or axles. The 11-Point River, which the wagon train would have crossed on their fourth day of travel, was particularly treacherous in the spring. Fed by countless springs that bulled up from the limestone bedrock, the river could rise several feet in a matter of hours if storms struck the watershed upstream. More than one wagon train had been forced to wait for days while floodwaters receded, camping on exposed riverbanks where they were vulnerable to both natural disasters and human predators. Local settlements were few and far between, consisting mainly of mills and trading posts that served the scattered homesteads hidden back in the hollows. These communities were tight-knit and suspicious of strangers, a wariness born of years of conflict and the harsh realities of frontier life. A traveler might find hospitality and assistance, but only after proving that he posed no threat to the delicate balance of survival that governed life in the mountains. The people who called the Ozarks home in 1878 were a hardy breed, descendants of Scotch-Irish settlers who had been pushing westward since colonial times. They lived by hunting, fishing, subsistence farming, and a dozen other skills that allowed them to wrest a living from land that defeated less determined souls. Their knowledge of the mountains was encyclopedic. They knew every cave, every spring, every hidden valley, and secret passage. But they also knew that the mountains held dangers that even their deep understanding could not always predict or prevent. Among the families traveling with Jonathan Hale's wagon train, there was a mixture of experience and innocence that would prove tragically significant in the days to come. The wagon master himself was no stranger to danger, having survived encounters with hostile Indians, outlaw gangs, and natural disasters during his years on various frontier trails. His wife Eleanor, despite her premonitions, was also a veteran of frontier life, capable of loading and firing a rifle as accurately as any man in the party. Samuel Brennan, the blacksmith, wrought skills that were invaluable on any journey where mechanical breakdowns could mean the difference between life and death. His massive shoulders and powerful arms could bend iron or break trail through obstacles that would stop other men, and his knowledge of metalworking had already proven useful in making emergency repairs to wagon hardware and horseshoes. But Martha, his pregnant wife, was beginning to show signs of the stress that travel was placing on her condition, and the twins were too young to be of help in any crisis. Thomas Cooper had been a successful merchant in Springfield, but his knowledge of commerce and inventory was of limited use in the wilderness. His wife Rebecca was a genteel woman who had never fired a gun or slept under the stars before this journey began. Their teenage daughter Sarah was at that awkward age where she was no longer a child but not yet fully adult, caught between fascination with the adventure of their journey and homesickness for the familiar comforts of civilization. Old Henrik Larsson was perhaps the most enigmatic member of the party. His English was limited, though he seemed to understand more than he let on, and his past was a mystery that he kept locked behind pale blue eyes that had seen more than their share of hardship. The tools in his wagon suggested skills that went far beyond simple carpentry. There were implements for fine woodworking, metalcraft, and even what appeared to be surveying equipment. When questioned about his plans, he would only smile and point toward the mountains, muttering something in Norwegian that sounded like a prayer, or perhaps an incantation. Billy Thornton, the young scout, was in many ways the eyes and ears of the entire party. His ability to read sign and interpret the subtle messages that the wilderness constantly provided had already prevented at least 2 potential disasters: a creek crossing that would have mired the wagons in quicksand, and a camping spot that bore the marks of recent bear activity. But Then his keen senses were being tested by the strange quality of the Ozark landscape, where familiar signs seemed to take on different meanings, and normal patterns of wildlife behavior were subtly but persistently altered. The Kelly family brought their own unique perspective to the journey. Driven from Ireland by famine, and from eastern cities by prejudice, they were perhaps more accustomed to hardship and uncertainty than any other members of the party. Patrick Kelly had fought in the Civil War with an Irish regiment from Massachusetts, and his knowledge of military tactics and discipline had already proven valuable in organizing the wagon train's defensive arrangements. His wife, Bridget, was a woman of remarkable resilience, capable of finding humor and hope in the darkest circumstances, while their children had inherited both their parents' toughness and their gift for adapting to changing conditions. The Washington family represented yet another perspective on the American dream. Freed from slavery only 13 years earlier, they were traveling not just toward new opportunities, but away from a past that still threatened to reclaim them. Moses Washington had taught himself to read and write in secret during his years in bondage, and had used that knowledge to become a skilled carpenter and occasional preacher. His wife, Ruth, was a healer, whose knowledge of medicinal plants and folk remedies had already proved invaluable to other members of the party. Their children carried themselves with the quiet dignity of those who had learned early that freedom was a precious thing that must be constantly protected. As the wagon train penetrated deeper into the Ozark wilderness, these diverse backgrounds and skill sets would be tested in ways that none of them could have imagined. The mountains themselves seemed to be watching, evaluating, and perhaps preparing to render some ancient and terrible judgment on these latest intruders into their primordial domain. On the morning of April 16th, the wagon train broke camp beside Roaring River, with no indication that the previous night's strange experiences had been anything more than the product of tired minds and unfamiliar surroundings. The fog had lifted with the dawn, revealing a valley of almost supernatural beauty, where wildflowers carpeted meadows that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The stream ran crystal clear over beds of multicolored pebbles, and the surrounding forest displayed every shade of green that nature had ever devised. But there were subtle signs that something had changed during those dark hours before dawn. Several of the livestock bore scratches and cuts that their handlers could not explain. Not serious injuries, but marks that suggested encounters with thorns or branches that should not have been present in the carefully cleared camping area. Billy Thornton found tracks near the downstream end of the camp that defied easy interpretation. Impressions in the soft earth that might have been made by human feet, but which were too large and showed an odd, shuffling gait that suggested either injury or some fundamental difference in anatomy. More disturbing still was the discovery that several items were missing from the camp. Nothing of great value: a spare horseshoe from the blacksmith's wagon, a wooden bucket that had been left by the stream to collect water, a child's rag doll that had been carefully tucked into a wagon the night before. The missing items seemed to have been selected at random, as if by someone who was more interested in the act of taking than in the value of what was taken. Jonathan Hale spent an extra hour examining the campsite before giving the order to move out. His experienced eye detected other anomalies. Places where the grass had been flattened in patterns that suggested the presence of a large group of people or animals, though no such group had been visible even in the fog. There were also scorch marks on some of the trees around the camp's perimeter, as if they had been subjected to intense heat, though no fires had been built anywhere near those locations. Despite these unsettling discoveries, Hale decided to continue with the planned route. The alternatives were to turn back toward Springfield, abandoning their dreams of new opportunities in the Arkansas Territory, or to attempt a detour through even more remote and potentially dangerous country. Neither option seemed preferable to pressing forward along a trail that he had traveled before, even if that previous journey had been under very different circumstances. The wagon train's route took them steadily deeper into the heart of the Ozark Mountains, following valleys that grew narrower and more isolated with each passing mile. The forest pressed closer to the trail, its canopy so dense that even the midday sun struggled to penetrate to the forest floor. Ancient trees, oaks, hickories, and maples that had been growing since before the first European had set foot on the continent, created a cathedral-like atmosphere that seemed to demand whispered conversations and reverent behavior. Streams became more frequent and more treacherous, requiring careful navigation to find safe crossing points. Some of the waterways appeared on no maps that Hale possessed, flowing from unknown sources deep in the mountains and disappearing into limestone caves that could have led anywhere beneath the earth. The sound of running water became a constant companion, sometimes barely audible, sometimes roaring loud enough to make conversation impossible. It was along one of these unnamed streams that the wagon train made its final confirmed contact with civilization. A trapper named Ezekiel Morrison, who had been working the beaver dams in the upper reaches of the current river, encountered the wagons on the afternoon of April 16th as they followed a tributary that would eventually join the main river several miles downstream. Morrison later testified that the wagon train appeared to be in good order, with all members present and accounted for, and no obvious signs of distress or mechanical problems. The trapper spoke briefly with Jonathan Hale, sharing information about trail conditions ahead and recommending a particular ford where the stream could be crossed safely. Morrison also warned about a late-season storm that appeared to be building in the western mountains, suggesting that the wagon train might want to find shelter for the night rather than attempting to make additional miles through increasingly difficult terrain. But what Morrison remembered most clearly about the encounter was the strange behavior of the livestock. The oxen and horses seemed unusually agitated, constantly looking back over their shoulders as if something was following the train. The dogs traveling with the families were particularly affected, whining and pacing in ways that the trapper had never seen before. When Morrison asked Hale about the animals' behavior, the wagon master could only shrug and admit that the livestock had been acting strangely since leaving their camp at Roaring River. Morrison was the last person to see the wagon train intact. After parting company with Hale and his party, the trapper continued upstream to check his beaver traps, while the wagons proceeded downstream toward the ford he had recommended. Morrison estimated that it was approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon when they separated, with several hours of daylight remaining for travel. That evening, Morrison made camp about 5 miles upstream from where he had encountered the wagon train. As darkness fell, he could see the glow of their campfires reflecting off the limestone bluffs that bordered the valley, and he could hear the distant sounds of human activity, the lowing of cattle, the barking of dogs, and the voices of children playing before bedtime. These sounds continued until well after full darkness, providing the last known evidence that the members of the wagon train were alive and well. But sometime during the night, between the time when Morrison's fire burned down to coals and the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the forest canopy, something happened in that hidden valley that would erase every trace of 23 human beings from the face of the earth. When Morrison broke camp the next morning and traveled downstream to check on the wagon train's progress, he found only empty wilderness where their camp should have been. The clearing where they had obviously spent the night showed signs of recent occupation, areas where grass had been flattened by sleeping bodies, circles of stones that had contained campfires, and patches of earth that had been disturbed by the hooves of livestock. But the wagons were gone, the people were gone, and the animals were gone. Even more mysteriously, there were no clear tracks leading away from the campsite in any direction. Morrison spent the entire day searching the area, following every possible route that the wagon train might have taken to leave the valley. He found scattered evidence of their passage. A broken wagon spoke near the stream, fragments of cloth caught on thorns, and what appeared to be the remains of a hastily abandoned meal. But he could find no trail that would explain how an entire wagon train had departed from a valley that had only one practical entrance and exit. Growing increasingly alarmed, Morrison abandoned his trapping expedition and rode hard for the nearest settlement, a mill town called Thomasville that lay 20 miles to the northeast. There he reported his discovery to the local constable, a man named Joshua Bramlett, who had served as a scout during the Civil War and was familiar with the courier. Untry where the wagon train had disappeared. Bramlett immediately organized a search party and dispatched riders to alert authorities in Springfield and other nearby towns. But even as news of the missing wagon train began to spread throughout the region, the mystery was deepening in ways that would challenge every rational explanation and give birth to legends that would persist for generations to come. The reaction to news of the missing wagon train spread through the frontier communities of southwestern Missouri like ripples on a still pond, each successive wave carrying increased urgency and mounting dread. In Springfield, the families and friends of the missing travelers gathered in the courthouse square, demanding answers that no one could provide and action that seemed impossible to coordinate in the vast wilderness where the wagon train had vanished. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks of Howell County was a man accustomed to dealing with the everyday violence and lawlessness that plagued the post-war frontier. He had tracked down murderers and horse thieves, broken up feuds that had simmered for generations, and restored order to communities torn apart by vigilante justice. But the disappearance of an entire wagon train presented challenges that stretched beyond his experience and resources. Brooks was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, whose gray beard and steady eyes reflected years of making life and death decisions in circumstances where hesitation could prove fatal. He had served with distinction as a Union cavalry officer during the war, leading reconnaissance missions deep into Confederate territory and surviving more than one encounter with rebel guerrillas who showed no mercy to captured enemies. His knowledge of the Ozark backcountry was encyclopedic, gained through years of hunting wanted men through terrain that defeated less persistent lawmen. But as Brooks studied the crude maps available in 1878 and listened to Morrison's account of the wagon train's disappearance, he began to appreciate the magnitude of the task that lay before him. The area where the wagons had vanished encompassed hundreds of square miles of some of the most rugged and inaccessible terrain in North America. Much of it had never been properly surveyed, and what maps did exist were based on sketchy information provided by hunters, trappers, and military expeditions that had passed through the region years or even decades earlier. The sheriff's first step was to organize a systematic search of the area where Morrison had last seen the wagon train. He assembled a party of 20 experienced woodsmen, including several former Confederate soldiers who had intimate knowledge of the region's hidden valleys and secret passages. The group was equipped with enough supplies for 2 weeks in the wilderness and carried signal equipment that would allow them to maintain communication across the rough terrain. The search party departed Springfield on April 22nd, exactly 1 week after the wagon train had disappeared. They made good time to the Current River Valley, following established trails that presented no unusual difficulties. But as they penetrated deeper into the area where the missing wagons had last been seen, they began to encounter phenomena that defied easy explanation and challenged their understanding of the natural world. The first anomaly was discovered at the campsite where Morrison had last seen signs of the wagon train's presence. Although a full week had passed since the disappearance, the evidence of the wagon's overnight stay remained unnaturally fresh and distinct. Grass that should have recovered from being flattened still lay pressed against the earth as if weighted down by invisible forces. Ashes from cooking fires showed no signs of having been scattered by wind or washed away by rain, despite several spring showers that had passed through the region during the intervening days. More puzzling still was, too, the complete absence of scavenger activity in the area. Normally, any campsite in the wilderness would attract raccoons, possums, and other creatures drawn by food scraps and the lingering scents of human habitation. But the abandoned campsite showed no sign of animal visitation. No tracks, no disturbed earth, no evidence that any living creature had entered the area since the wagon train's departure. John Whitaker, one of the former Confederate soldiers in the search party, was an expert tracker whose skills had kept rebel raiding parties one step ahead of Union pursuit throughout the war. As he examined the campsite and the surrounding area, his weather-beaten face took on an expression of growing confusion and concern. The sign that he was reading told a story that made no sense according to everything he had learned about tracking human and animal movement through wilderness terrain. "Sheriff," Whitaker said, his voice carrying the slow, measured cadence of the southern mountains, "I've been following tracks through these hills for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. These folks just vanished, and I mean vanished. There's no trail leading away from this camp in any direction. It's like they just rose up into the air and disappeared." Brooks knelt beside the tracker, examining the disturbed earth with his own experienced eye. Whitaker was right. The campsite showed clear evidence of recent occupation, but there were no tracks leading away from it except for Morrison's own boot prints and horse sign. Even more mysteriously, the tracks and wagon ruts leading into the campsite seemed to fade and disappear as they approached the area where the wagons had obviously spent their final night. The search party spent 3 days thoroughly examining every square yard of ground within a mile radius of the abandoned campsite. They found scattered pieces of evidence that confirmed the wagon train's presence: scraps of fish, a brick, a child's broken toy, a few scattered coins, and the wooden bucket that Morrison had mentioned seeing taken from his own camp days earlier. But none of these items were found in locations that suggested a coherent pattern of movement or provided clues about the direction the missing people might have taken. As the days passed and the search expanded to cover an ever-widening area, more disturbing discoveries began to emerge. Near a limestone bluff about 2 miles downstream from the campsite, searchers found a broken wagon wheel that had obviously been subjected to tremendous force. The wheel was not simply damaged, but appeared to have been twisted and compressed, as if caught in some kind of gigantic vice. Splinters of wood from the wheel were embedded in nearby trees, at heights that suggested an explosion or impact of tremendous violence. But there was no crater, no sign of fire, and no other debris that might explain how a wagon wheel could have been destroyed with such force. The wheel's iron rim was found separately, wrapped around the trunk of an oak tree in a configuration that would have required either enormous strength or sophisticated machinery to achieve. Yet there were no tool marks on the metal and no evidence that any kind of equipment had been present in the area. The discovery that would haunt Sheriff Brooks for the rest of his life was made on the 5th day of the search, in a narrow canyon about 4 miles southeast of the abandoned campsite. Deputy Marshal Tom Keegan, a former Union Army engineer who had joined the search party at Brooks's request, was investigating what appeared to be an old mine shaft when he called for assistance in examining something that defied immediate explanation. At the bottom of a limestone sinkhole, approximately 30 feet deep, Keegan had found what appeared to be the remains of several campfires arranged in a perfect circle. The fires had obviously burned with tremendous heat. The limestone around each fire pit had been calcified and cracked, while the earth between them had been baked to the hardness of pottery. But most disturbing of all were the objects that had been placed at the center of the circle. There, arranged with obvious care and deliberation, were personal items that had undoubtedly belonged to members of the missing wagon train. A woman's wedding ring that Eleanor Hale's sister later identified as belonging to the wagon master's wife. A child's primer that bore the name Sarah Cooper, written in a careful schoolgirl's hand. A leather-bound Bible with Henrik Larsson inscribed on the inside cover in the spidery script of an elderly man. And most chilling of all, a daguerreotype photograph of the entire wagon train taken in Springfield just before their departure that showed all 23 members of the party posed beside their wagons with expressions of hope and excitement for the journey ahead. But the photograph had been altered in a way that made seasoned lawmen cross themselves and mutter prayers. Each face in the image had been carefully scratched out with what appeared to be a sharp knife, obliterating the features of men, women, and children with methodical precision. The scratches were so deep that they had cut completely through the metal plate on which the image was fixed, creating holes that seemed to stare back at the viewers like empty eye sockets. Sheriff Brooks carefully collected these items as evidence, wrapping them in canvas and storing them in his saddlebags with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. But even as he went through the motions of official investigation, he was beginning to suspect that he was dealing with something that lay far beyond the scope of conventional law enforcement. The evidence pointed not toward any ordinary crime, but toward something that challenged the very foundations of rational thought. As word of these discoveries spread back to the settlements and towns of southwestern Missouri, theories about the fate of the missing wagon train began to multiply like wildfire. In the saloons and general stores where men gathered to discuss the events of the day, conversations inevitably turned to speculation about what could have caused an entire group of people to vanish so completely and so mysteriously. The most conventional explanation involved Confederate guerrillas or common outlaws who might have ambushed the wagon train for its supplies and livestock. The Ozark Mountains had been a stronghold for irregular forces during the Civil War, and many former soldiers had never fully returned to civilian life. Bands of armed men still roamed the more remote areas, supporting themselves through robbery and extortion while avoiding the long arm of federal law enforcement. But this theory faced several significant problems. First, there was no evidence of violence at the abandoned campsite. No bloodstains, no signs of struggle, no abandoned weapons or other debris that typically marked the scene of an armed encounter. Second, outlaws interested in the wagon train's supplies would have had no reason to destroy or hide the wagons themselves, which represented valuable transportation in a region where such equipment was scarce and expensive. Finally, the personal items found in the limestone sinkhole had been arranged with a ritualistic precision that suggested motives far more complex than simple robbery. A second theory focused on the possibility of Indian attack, despite the fact that most Native American tribes had been forcibly relocated from Missouri decades earlier. A few isolated bands of Cherokee and Osage were known to have remained hidden in the most remote areas of the Ozarks, and tensions between Indians and white settlers still occasionally flared into violence. Some local residents claimed to have seen smoke signals in the mountains shortly before the wagon train's disappearance, while others reported finding strange markings carved into trees along various mountain trails. But this explanation also had significant weaknesses. The few remaining Indians in the region were small bands focused primarily on survival and staying hidden from government authorities. They lacked both the numbers and the inclination to attack a well-armed wagon train, and they would have had no use for most of the supplies that such a train would carry. Moreover, the ritualistic arrangement of personal items in the sinkhole bore no resemblance to known Native American practices or religious ceremonies. A third category of theories involved natural disasters or accidents that might have caused the wagon train to become lost or trapped in the complex cave systems that honeycomb the Ozark Mountains. Sinkholes could open suddenly, swallowing entire buildings or sections of forest floor. Flash floods could turn peaceful streams into raging torrents that swept away everything in their path. And the limestone caverns that lay beneath much of the region contained vast underground chambers and miles of unmapped passages where lost travelers might wander for days without finding an exit. But even these possibilities failed to account for the complete absence of debris, or the supernatural precision with which the wagon train seemed to have vanished. If the wagons had fallen into a sinkhole, there should have been wreckage visible at the bottom. If they had been caught in a flash flood, debris would have been scattered for miles downstream. And if the travelers had become lost in caves, their abandoned wagons would still have been found at whatever entrance they had used to descend into the underground labyrinth. As the official search continued into its second week with no significant new discoveries, Sheriff Brooks found himself facing mounting pressure from Springfield's political establishment and the families of the missing travelers. Town merchants who had supplied the wagon train demanded to know what had happened to their merchandise. Politicians who had encouraged westward migration were forced to confront the possibility that they had sent innocent families to their deaths. And most persistently, the wives and children of the missing men pleaded for information that Brooks simply did not possess. The sheriff's sleep became troubled by nightmares that featured endless searches through misty valleys where familiar landmarks appeared and disappeared like mirages. During the day, he found himself studying maps of the region with an obsessive intensity, searching for some geographical feature or historical incident that might explain the wagon train's fate. But the mountains kept their secrets, and the mystery deepened with each passing day. It was during this period of official frustration and growing public anxiety that the first reports of supernatural phenomena began to emerge from the search area. These accounts came initially from members of Brooks's own search parties, experienced woodsmen and former soldiers who were not given to flights of fancy or susceptible to the kind of mass hysteria that sometimes affected civilian populations during times of crisis. The first such report came from Deputy Tom Keegan, the same man who had discovered the ritualistic arrangement of personal items in the limestone sinkhole. Keegan was conducting a night patrol of the area around the abandoned campsite when he reported seeing lights moving through the forest in a pattern that suggested a group of people carrying lanterns. The lights appeared to be following the same route that the missing wagon train would have taken, moving slow, and methodically through terrain that Keegan knew to be virtually impassable in darkness. Keegan followed the lights for nearly an hour, trying to get close enough to identify their source and make contact with whoever was carrying them. But every time he seemed to be closing the distance, the lights would suddenly change direction or simply disappear, only to reappear minutes later in a location that should have required hours to reach on foot. Finally, as dawn began to break over the eastern ridges, the lights vanished completely, leaving Keegan alone in a section of forest where no human tracks could be found, despite the obvious presence of someone or something only minutes before. Similar sightings were reported by other members of the search party over the following nights. The lights always appeared in the same general area, always seemed to follow the same basic route, and always disappeared without leaving any physical evidence of their passage. But the searchers began to notice other phenomena as well. Sounds that seemed to come from no identifiable source, changes in temperature that occurred suddenly and without apparent cause, and an overall sense of being watched by invisible eyes that followed their every movement. More disturbing still were the reports of voices heard echoing through the valleys on still nights when sound should have carried clearly for miles in any direction. These were not the voices of wildlife or the natural sounds of wind and water moving through the landscape. They were distinctly human voices, men, women, and children speaking in conversational tones that were almost but not quite clear enough to understand. Sometimes, the voices seemed to be discussing ordinary subjects like the weather or the condition of the trail. At other times, they took on notes of urgency or distress that made the searchers' blood run cold. John Whitaker, the Confederate veteran who had first examined the abandoned campsite, reported an encounter that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While investigating a side canyon that appeared to offer a possible route away from the main valley, Whitaker heard what sounded like a child crying somewhere in the darkness ahead. Following the sound, he climbed over fallen logs and pushed through dense underbrush until he emerged into a small clearing where moonlight filtered through the forest canopy. There, sitting on a fallen log with her back turned toward him, was a small figure that appeared to be a young girl. She was wearing a dress that Whitaker recognized as similar to the clothing worn by the Cooper family's teenage daughter, and her long hair fell across her shoulders in a way that seemed familiar from the daguerreotype photograph that had been found in the sinkhole. The child was crying softly, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to echo strangely in the confined space of the clearing. Whitaker approached slowly, speaking in the gentle tones he would use with his own granddaughter, trying to reassure the child that she was safe and that help had arrived. But as he drew closer, the crying gradually stopped, and the small figure began to turn toward him. Whitaker later said that he would never forget the moment when he saw the child's face, or rather, the place where her face should have been. Instead of features, there was only a smooth, blank surface that reflected the moonlight like still water. The child had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Nothing that would identify her as human, except for the general shape of her head and the long hair that framed the terrible emptiness where a face should have been. For several seconds, Whitaker stood frozen in place, unable to process what he was seeing or decide how to react. Then the figure began to rise from the log, moving with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural for a human child. As it stood, it seemed to grow taller and more substantial until it loomed over the Confederate veteran, despite his own considerable height. Whitaker's paralysis broke, and he turned and ran from the clearing with a speed and desperation that he had not felt since his last cavalry charge during the war. When he finally stopped running and looked back, the clearing was empty. But the sound of crying had resumed, now seeming to come from all directions at once, as if the entire forest was mourning some terrible loss that could never be recovered or healed. These supernatural encounters took a heavy toll on the morale and effectiveness of the search parties. Men who had faced down Confederate cavalry charges or tracked dangerous outlaws through hostile territory found themselves jumping at shadows and refusing to venture alone into areas where the mysterious phenomena had been reported. Sheriff Brooks was forced to rotate his personnel frequently, as searchers requested reassignment or simply abandoned their posts and returned to town without authorization. But even as the official search began to wind down due to these practical difficulties, the mystery of the missing wagon train continued to attract attention from unexpected sources. Word of the disappearance had spread beyond the borders of Missouri, carried by newspaper reports and travelers' tales to distant cities, where the story captured the imagination of readers hungry for accounts of frontier adventure and unexplained mysteries. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat, the largest newspaper in the region, dispatched a correspondent named Marcus Blackwood to investigate the story and provide readers with first-hand accounts of the search efforts. Blackwood was an experienced journalist who had covered the Civil War and various Indian campaigns, and he approached the assignment with the skeptical eye of a professional news man who had seen enough human folly and natural disaster to account for most unexplained events. But after spending 2 weeks in the Ozark Mountains and interviewing dozens of witnesses, Blackwood found himself forced to acknowledge that the fate of the missing wagon train defied conventional explanation. His reports, published in a series of front-page articles during the summer of 1878, brought national attention to the mystery and established it as one of the most puzzling disappearances in American history. Blackwood's investigation uncovered several additional pieces of evidence that had been overlooked by the official search parties. In a remote valley about 8 miles from the abandoned campsite, he found wagon ruts that appeared to match the wheel spacing of the vehicles that had belonged to the missing train. But these ruts led directly to the base of a sheer limestone cliff that rose more than 200 feet above the valley floor. There was no gap in the cliff face, no cave entrance, and no possible route by which wheeled vehicles could have continued beyond that point. Even more puzzling was Blackwood's discovery of what appeared to be campsites at various locations throughout the search area. These sites showed clear evidence of recent occupation, flattened grass, cold fire pits, and areas where horses had been picketed. But they were located in places that no wagon train could possibly have reached. Some were on narrow ledges, high up on cliff faces, accessible only to experienced rock climbers. Others were in the middle of dense forests, where the trees grew so closely together that a man on horseback would have difficulty passing, let alone a wagon train with oxen and supplies. The journalist's most disturbing discovery came during his final week in the region, when local guides took him to a cave system known as Devil's Den, located about 12 miles southeast of where the wagon train had disappeared. The cave was well known to local residents as a source of pure spring water and a cool retreat during the hot summer months, but it had acquired a sinister reputation since the disappearance of the wagon train. According to the guides, voices could now be heard echoing from the deepest recesses of the cave system. Conversations and crying that seemed to come from chambers that were too deep and dangerous for exploration. Several local men had attempted to investigate these sounds, but all had returned with reports of becoming lost in passages that seemed to change configuration when they weren't looking, and of encountering obstacles that had not been present during previous visits to the caves. Blackwood himself ventured only a short distance into the cave system, but even that limited exploration provided him with experiences that challenged his journalistic skepticism. As he made his way through the entrance chamber, guided by torchlight and following a path that local residents assured him was safe and well established, he began to hear what sounded like distant conversation echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave. The voices were too far away and too distorted by the cave's acoustics to be clearly understood, but they had an unmistakably human quality that distinguished them from the random sounds that wind and water might produce in an underground environment. There seemed to be several different speakers, men, women, and what might have been children, engaged in the kind of ordinary conversation that families might have around a campfire at the end of a long day's travel. But as Blackwood listened more carefully, he began to detect notes of distress and confusion in the voices. The conversations seemed to be punctuated by crying and what might have been prayers or pleas for help. At one point, he distinctly heard what sounded like a woman calling for her children, and her voice echoing through the cave chambers with a desperation that made the journalist's blood run cold. Blackwood attempted to follow the sounds deeper into the cave system, but his guides refused to accompany him beyond the entrance chamber. When he tried to continue alone, he quickly became disoriented in a maze of passages that seemed to branch and converge in patterns that defied mapping. After nearly becoming lost himself, he was forced to retreat to the surface, where he spent several hours trying to process what he had experienced. The journalist's final report on the missing wagon train was published in the Globe-Democrat on September 15, 1878, exactly 5 months after the disappearance. In it, Blackwood acknowledged that despite extensive investigation and the application of the most advanced techniques available to 19th-century journalism, he had been unable to determine what had happened to the 23 people who had vanished in the Ozark Mountains. I have covered wars and disasters throughout my career, Blackwood wrote in his concluding paragraph, and I have learned to distinguish between the possible and the impossible, between natural phenomena and the products of human imagination. But the fate of Jonathan Hale's wagon train defies such easy categorization. Something happened in those ancient mountains that challenges our understanding of the natural world and forces us to confront possibilities that our rational minds are reluctant to accept. The newspaper's coverage of the mystery attracted attention from investigators and curiosity seekers throughout the United States, and even from Europe, where accounts of American frontier mysteries had become popular reading in the growing number of periodicals devoted to tales of adventure and the supernatural. But despite this widespread interest and the efforts of numerous amateur and professionists, investigators, no additional evidence was uncovered that shed light on the wagon train's fate. As the months passed and the initial excitement surrounding the disappearance began to fade, the missing wagon train gradually became part of the folklore and oral tradition of the Ozark Mountains. Parents used the story to warn children about the dangers of wandering alone in the wilderness, while travelers shared accounts of supernatural encounters in the area where the wagons had vanished. But the mystery refused to remain safely confined to the realm of folklore and legend. Throughout the remainder of 1878, and well into the following year, reports continued to emerge of strange phenomena in the region where the wagon train had disappeared. These reports came from a wide variety of sources: hunters, trappers, travelers, and even government survey teams that were mapping the area for potential railroad development. The most common reports involved sightings of ghostly figures moving through the forest at night, sometimes appearing as solitary individuals, but more often as entire groups that seemed to be following the same routes that a wagon train might have taken through the mountainous terrain. These figures were always seen at a distance and always disappeared when observers attempted to approach them or make contact. But there were also more disturbing accounts that suggested the supernatural activity in the region was not limited to harmless apparitions. Several hunters reported finding their campsites disturbed during the night, with personal belongings rearranged or missing entirely. Others told of becoming lost in familiar territory, as if the landscape itself had changed while they weren't looking. A few reported encounters with figures that appeared human at first glance, but revealed disturbing abnormalities when seen more clearly. Faces that were blank or distorted, movements that defied natural law, and voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, at once. One of the most detailed accounts came from a timber surveyor named James Hartwell, who was working for a railroad company that was considering a route through the Ozark Mountains. In November 1878, Hartwell and his team were measuring timber stands in the valley where the wagon train had made its final camp when they encountered phenomena that would haunt them for years to come. According to Hartwell's official report, his team had been working in the area for 3 days without incident when they began to notice that their surveying instruments were producing inconsistent readings. Compass bearings would change from one reading to the next, even when the instrument was held in exactly the same position. Transit measurements of distances and elevations would vary dramatically between consecutive readings, as if the landscape itself was shifting and changing when no one was looking. On the third night of their stay in the valley, Hartwell was awakened by the sound of voices and activity coming from the direction of the abandoned campsite. Looking out from his tent, he could see what appeared to be the glow of campfires and the silhouettes of people moving about in the distance. Assuming that another group of travelers had arrived in the valley, Hartwell dressed and walked toward the lights to make contact and offer assistance if needed. But as he approached the area where the lights had been visible, they seemed to recede before him, always remaining just out of reach despite his continued movement in their direction. The voices he had heard from his tent continued, but they now seemed to be coming from all around him rather than from any specific location. He could distinguish individual speakers, Men discussing the condition of their livestock, women talking about cooking and children themselves playing games and asking questions about their journey. But when Hartwell called out to identify himself and offer help, his voice seemed to be absorbed by the darkness without producing any echo or response. The conversations continued as if he were not present, and the lights remained tantalizingly just beyond his reach. Finally, growing concerned about becoming lost in the darkness, Hartwell turned back toward his own camp, guided by the light of his team's fire. When he looked back one final time, the mysterious lights had disappeared completely, and the voices had fallen silent. But as he reached his own tent and prepared to return to sleep, he noticed something that made him question his own sanity. Arranged in a neat circle around his team's campfire were items that had not been there when he had left to investigate the mysterious lights. There was a woman's bonnet that showed signs of long exposure to weather, but was not of any style that Hartwell recognized from current fashion. A child's wooden toy horse, carved with the kind of care and attention to detail that suggested it had been a treasured possession. A man's leather hat that bore the distinctive marks of long use on frontier trails. And most disturbing of all, a daguerreotype photograph that showed a group of people posed beside covered wagons, but when Hartwell examined it closely by firelight, he discovered that all the faces in the image had been scratched out with methodical precision. Hartwell carefully collected these items and included them with his official report to the railroad company, along with a detailed account of his team's experiences in the valley. But the railroad executives who received the report were more interested in timber yields and construction costs than in supernatural phenomena, and Hartwell's account was filed away and forgotten. The surveyor himself requested reassignment to other projects and never returned to the Ozark Mountains. As reports of supernatural activity in the region continued to accumulate, a pattern began to emerge that suggested the phenomena were not random or chaotic, but followed certain consistent rules and limitations. The ghostly figures were most commonly seen during certain phases of the moon and under specific weather conditions. The mysterious voices were most often heard on still nights when sound would carry clearly through the mountain valleys. And the physical manifestations, the appearance of objects that had belonged to the missing wagon train, seemed to occur most frequently in locations that corresponded to places where the missing travelers would logically have made camp or stopped to rest. This consistency suggested to some investigators that the phenomena might be more than simple ghost stories or mass hallucination. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, a professor of natural philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis, became interested in the case after reading Marcus Blackwood's newspaper reports. Dr. Whitman had made a career of investigating claims of supernatural phenomena with the tools of scientific method, and he believed that most such claims could be explained through careful observation and logical analysis. In the spring of 1879, exactly 1 year after the wagon train's disappearance, Dr. Whitman organized an expedition to the Ozark Mountains with the goal of conducting a systematic investigation of the reported phenomena. His team included a photographer, a geologist, a meteorologist, and several graduate students who were trained in the techniques of scientific observation and data collection. The expedition spent 6 weeks in the region, using the most advanced instruments available in the 19th century to measure and document any unusual activity. They recorded temperature fluctuations, barometric pressure changes, electromagnetic variations, and acoustic phenomena with a precision that had never before been applied to the investigation of supernatural claims. Dr. Whitman's team did indeed document phenomena that defied easy explanation. Photographic plates exposed during the night frequently showed light sources that had not been visible to the naked eye, arranged in patterns that suggested organized human activity. Temperature measurements revealed localized areas of extreme cold that persisted even during warm spring weather and could not be explained by known meteorological processes. And acoustic recordings captured voices and conversations that seemed to have no identifiable source in the physical environment. But perhaps most significant were the geological anomalies that the team discovered throughout the region. The limestone bedrock showed evidence of recent stress and deformation that could not be explained by normal geological processes. Cave systems that had been mapped and explored for generations showed new passages and chambers that had not existed during previous surveys. And most mysteriously, the team's instruments detected what appeared to be vast underground spaces that seemed to shift and change location between successive measurements. Dr. Whitman's final report, published in the Proceedings of the American Society for Scientific Investigation in 1880, concluded that the disappearance of the wagon train and the subsequent supernatural phenomena could not be explained by any known natural processes. The professor, who had built his reputation on debunking false claims of paranormal activity, was forced to acknowledge that he had encountered something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of 19th century science. The evidence we have collected, Dr. Whitman wrote, suggests that the region where the wagon train disappeared has been subjected to forces or influences that lie outside the scope of current scientific understanding. Whether these forces are natural phenomena that science has not yet discovered, or whether they represent something that transcends the natural world entirely, I cannot say. But I can state with certainty that 23 human beings did indeed vanish from the face of the earth in circumstances that cannot be explained by conventional means. The professor's report generated considerable controversy within the scientific community, with some colleagues questioning his methodology and others suggesting that his reputation had been damaged by prolonged exposure to frontier superstitions. But Dr. Whitman stood by his conclusions, and his report became one of the foundational documents in the emerging field of paranormal investigation. As the decade of the 1870s drew to a close, the mystery of the missing wagon train had become deeply embedded in the folklore and cultural memory of the Ozark Mountains. The story was told and retold around countless campfires, each telling adding new details and interpretations while preserving the essential elements of the mystery. Parents used the tale to teach children about the dangers that lurked in the wilderness, while travelers shared it as both entertainment and warning for those who might be tempted to venture into the more remote areas of the mountains. But the story also began to take on a life of its own, evolving and changing as it passed from mouth to mouth and from generation to generation. Some versions emphasized the supernatural elements, transforming the missing travelers into ghostly figures who still wandered the mountain valleys in search of their lost destination. Others focused on more earthly explanations, suggesting that the wagon train had been victims of outlaws or natural disasters that had somehow concealed all evidence of their fate. One particularly persistent version of the story suggested that the travelers had discovered something in the mountains, perhaps a hidden valley, a lost gold mine, or an ancient Indian burial ground that had led to their destruction or transformation. According to this interpretation, the wagon train had not been victims of random misfortune, but had stumbled upon secrets that were meant to remain hidden from the outside world. This version of the story gained credibility from the accounts of various individuals who claimed to have discovered evidence of the wagon train's ultimate fate. Prospectors searching for gold or silver deposits in the region reported finding tools and equipment that might have belonged to the missing travelers, usually in locations that were so remote and inaccessible that it was difficult to imagine how such items could have arrived there through normal means. One prospector named Daniel Mackenzie claimed to have found an entire campsite in a hidden valley that could only be reached by descending through a series of limestone caves. According to Mackenzie, the campsite contained the remains of several wagons, along with personal belongings that clearly indicated the presence of families with children. But when Mackenzie attempted to guide other people to the location, he was unable to relocate the cave entrance that had provided access to the hidden valley. Similar accounts came from hunters and trappers who claimed to have discovered evidence of the missing wagon train in locations throughout the Ozark Mountains. But these discoveries were never substantiated, and attempts to recover the alleged evidence invariably ended in failure. The mountains seemed determined to guard their secrets, revealing tantalizing glimpses of the truth, only to conceal them again before anyone could document or verify what they had seen. As the 19th century progressed and the frontier gradually gave way to more settled communities, the story of the missing wagon train began to attract a different kind of attention. Writers and journalists searching for material that would appeal to readers hungry for tales of mystery, rye, and adventure began to visit the Ozark Mountains, hoping to uncover new information about the disappearance or to experience the supernatural phenomena that were still reported in the region. These literary investigations produced a steady stream of articles, books, and stories that kept the mystery alive in the popular imagination long after the original participants and witnesses had passed away. Some of these accounts were serious attempts to solve the mystery through careful research and investigation. Others were purely sensational pieces designed to thrill readers with tales of ghostly apparitions and supernatural encounters. But regardless of their quality or intent, these publications served to establish the missing wagon train as one of America's great unsolved mysteries, ranking alongside disappearances like the lost colony of Roanoke and the fate of the Franklin expedition in the Arctic. The story became part of the national folklore, familiar to readers throughout the United States and even in other countries where tales of American frontier adventure had found an audience. The dawn of the 20th century brought new technologies and investigative techniques that some hoped might finally solve the mystery of the missing wagon train. Photography, telegraphy, and improved transportation made it possible to conduct more systematic and thorough investigations of the region where the disappearance had occurred. Scientific instruments that had been unavailable to earlier investigators could now detect and measure phenomena that might have been overlooked by previous expeditions. But despite these technological advances, the essential mystery remained unsolved. If anything, modern investigation techniques seem to deepen the puzzle by revealing additional anomalies and inconsistencies that defied rational explanation. The region where the wagon train had disappeared continued to exhibit the same strange characteristics that had baffled investigators for decades: compass variations, temperature fluctuations, acoustic anomalies, and geological features that seemed to change between successive surveys. New generations of investigators approached the mystery with fresh perspectives and modern tools, but they invariably encountered the same frustrating obstacles that had defeated their predecessors. Physical evidence would appear and disappear with maddening unpredictability. Promising leads would evaporate when subjected to closer scrutiny, and the mountains themselves seemed to resist all attempts to unlock their secrets, maintaining their ancient silence with a stubbornness that outlasted the most persistent human efforts. The story of the missing wagon train also began to evolve in response to changing cultural attitudes and beliefs. The supernatural elements that had been accepted matter-of-factly by 19th century residents of the Ozark Mountains were increasingly viewed with skepticism by 20th century investigators who demanded more rigorous standards of proof. But this skepticism was balanced by a growing interest in paranormal phenomena and unexplained mysteries that reflected broader changes in American society and culture. The development of radio, and later television, provided new platforms for sharing the story of the missing wagon train with increasingly wide audiences. Radio dramatizations brought the mystery into living rooms across the country, while television documentaries used visual techniques to make the story more immediate and compelling than ever before. These media presentations helped to establish the missing wagon train as a permanent fixture in American popular culture, familiar to generations who had never set foot in the Ozark Mountains, but who recognized the story as part of their shared national mythology. But perhaps the most significant development in the story's evolution was the emergence of organized groups dedicated to investigating and documenting unexplained phenomena. These organizations, which began to appear in the early decades of the 20th century, brought new levels of systematic analysis and scientific rigor to the study of mysteries like the missing wagon train. They also provided forums for sharing information and coordinating research efforts among investigators who might otherwise have worked in isolation. One such organization, the American Society for Anomalous Research, was founded in 1923 specifically to investigate cases like the missing wagon train that seemed to defy conventional explanation. The Society's members included scientists, academics, and amateur investigators who shared a commitment to applying scientific methods to the study of unexplained phenomena. Under their auspices, the Ozark Mountains became the site of numerous expeditions and research projects that continued well into the mid-20th century. These scientific investigations produced volumes of data and documentation that far exceeded anything that had been available to earlier researchers. But despite this wealth of information, the essential mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. The missing wagon train had vanished so completely and so mysteriously that even the most advanced investigative techniques could not penetrate the veil of secrecy that surrounded their fate. As the decades passed and the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the story of the missing wagon train continued to evolve and adapt to changing times and circumstances. New generations of investigators brought fresh perspectives and cutting-edge technologies to bear on the mystery, but the mountains kept their secrets with the same stubborn determination that had frustrated seekers of truth for more than a century. The advent of satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and other advanced tools held promise for finally revealing what had happened to Jonathan Hale and his fellow travelers. But these modern miracles of technology proved no more effective than the crude instruments and intuitive methods used by the original searchers in 1878. The Ozark Mountains seemed to exist in a realm where normal rules of cause and effect held no sway, where the passage of time had no power to erode the barriers that protected their ancient mysteries. Today, more than a century and a half after the wagon train's disappearance, the mystery remains as compelling and unsolved as ever. Modern hikers exploring the remote valleys and hidden hollows of the Ozark Mountains still report encounters with phenomena that echo the experiences of those early searchers who first investigated the disappearance. Ghostly figures are still seen moving through the forest on moonlit nights. Voices still echo from limestone caves and hidden valleys where no living humans should be present. And personal belongings that seem to have belonged to the missing travelers still appear and disappear with the same maddening unpredictability that has characterized the mystery from its very beginning. The wagon ruts that some claim to see leading into impossible places have never been successfully photographed or documented, yet they continue to be reported by credible witnesses who have no reason to fabricate such accounts. The hidden valley that prospector Daniel Mackenzie claimed to have discovered has never been relocated, despite numerous attempts by experienced cavers and mountain climbers who have systematically explored every accessible cave system in the region. And somewhere, in the deepest recesses of the Ozark Mountains, in valleys where sunlight never penetrates, and silence reigns eternal, the mystery of the Missy. The wagon train continues to guard its secrets with the patience of stone and the persistence of time itself. 23 souls departed Springfield, Missouri, on a bright spring morning in 1878, bound for new lives and fresh opportunities in the territories beyond the mountains. They carried with them the hopes and dreams that had sustained American pioneers for generations, along with the simple possessions that represented their connections to home and family. But the mountains swallowed them as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions that have haunted investigators for nearly 150 years. Were they victims of human violence, natural disaster, or something that transcends both categories? Did they discover something in those ancient hills that was meant to remain hidden from the world? Or did they simply encounter forces that operate according to laws that human understanding has not yet penetrated? The answers to these questions remain locked in the limestone caverns and shadowed valleys of the Ozark Mountains, guarded by silence and protected by time. And perhaps, in a world that has solved so many mysteries and explained so many wonders, there is something almost comforting about the persistence of this enigma. A reminder that some secrets are meant to remain forever beyond the reach of human knowledge, preserved in the twilight realm where history blends with legend and truth becomes indistinguishable from myth. For those brave enough to venture into the deepest hollows of the Ozarks, where wagon wheels once rolled toward an unknown fate, the mystery lives on. In the whisper of wind through ancient trees, in the echo of voices that have no source, and in the persistent feeling that somewhere, just beyond the edge of perception, 23 lost souls continue their eternal journey through a landscape that exists between the world of the living and the realm of the forever vanished. The search that began in 1878 has never truly ended. It has simply transformed, becoming part of the living folklore of the Ozark Mountains, where every shadow might conceal a clue, and every unexplained sound might be the voice of someone who disappeared more than a century ago. And in that transformation, the missing wagon train has achieved a kind of immortality, becoming not just a historical mystery, but a permanent reminder of the limits of human knowledge and the enduring power of the unknown to capture our imagination and challenge our understanding of the world around us. As night falls over the Ozark Mountains and mist begins to rise from the hidden valleys where ancient secrets lie buried beneath layers of time and silence, the mystery continues. Somewhere in that labyrinth of limestone and shadow, the answer to one of America's greatest unsolved puzzles waits patiently for the day when the mountains might finally be ready to reveal what they have hidden for so long. Until that day comes, if it ever comes, the fate of Jonathan Hale's wagon train will remain what it has always been: a mystery that defies solution, a question without an answer, and a reminder that some stories are destined to remain forever unfinished. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.